the ethical presence. So remember earlier we talked about this idea of how am I aware of what is it that is impacting the client? Am I aware of my own beliefs that is coming across too hard? Am I aware of my own generational attitudes that is coming across to the client? So, for example, in each generation, we have a certain core belief about something. And that core belief can influence the way we engage the next generation of leaders or our coaches or our clients. So sometimes some organizations may call the clients coaches and creating a power distance. But yet, in some cultures, those are necessary because it creates a sense of honor and respect because the culture values honor. So they want to have that relationship of a coach-coach relationship. Now, yet some cultures, they want it to be on equal ground. In the coaching context, we talk about this idea of co-creation, which means that the client and you are on equal grounds. Regardless of age, regardless of experience, we're all on equal grounds. But we're on parallel grounds. So even if I have more experience than the client, what that means is that I'm coming to this context in helping the client gain deeper understanding of who they are and helping them to see, facilitating the conversation, not imposing my own values, but helping the client to see their own values in the whole process. So in this three A's, what's going to be important as well, it's for us to be aware, assess, and act on whatever that we are noticing from the client. So what is awareness is in the ethics consideration? Well, the first thing is to be aware of what is hitting the boundaries of our yes and no's. Okay, so for example, just now I gave the example of if the client comes to you with like with a topic that's very, very sensitive. Okay. Now, what if the client comes to you and say, "Oh, coach, I'm coming to you because I want to know, I want you to teach me how to become a better person." And then you look at the person, he reminds you of yourself when you were at that age. Now, what's the best thing we should do? So these are awareness that we need to be aware of. Like, oh, okay, should I inform him that this is beyond the scope of coaching, or do I address that issue and then refer him accordingly? Okay. Now, some coaches take a very, very hard approach. When they hear the client says, "Oh, coach, I want some advice on this," then the coach immediately responds, "Oh, no, 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 I don't give advice. If you want advice, you go somewhere else." Now, is that ethically correct? So if the client comes to you and says, "Coach, I want some advice on how to navigate my career," what would be your response to a client like this? Anyone? What are your thoughts?
When you're asking for advice, you could possibly, I mean, if I'm finding myself in a bind, I could possibly talk about it and then decide if I want to go ahead and continue. Would that be the right way? Instead of being the hard, what you said, I can't give you advice, because by coaching we don't give advice. Is what we are basically, as you said, co-creating, right?
Mm-hmm.
So earlier you also mentioned about it reminds of yourself. Is it okay to say that and then say and then move forward with it?
Mm-hmm. So what would you do if the client says, "Hey, Guru, can you give me some advice?"
Yeah, I would probably say the same thing. Under a coaching agreement, we are not giving advice. I'm here to help you discover the way forward, but not really giving an advice.
Okay, so thanks, Guru. So Guru has a response like this, right? He'll be more directly to tell them that under the coaching, we're not here to give you advice. How would the rest of you respond?
I will ask more questions first to unpack that sentence about career advice
Mm-hmm.
before responding further whether I should say that it's unlimited, because I'm not a career coach or something like that. Or then I will refer lah, but I will ask a bit more first, I guess.
Okay, so Irene will ask a little bit more. Okay, How about the rest? What would you do if the client comes to you? So Shin C says, try to adopt a third person perspective and place ourselves temporarily in a different role, counselor or good friend. Okay. And anyone else? What would you do? Is it? This sounds difficult, but this is a common.
First question, we all have different answers.
Notice everyone has different answer. No, something is wrong already, right? Now, this is where because it's not a hard black line or white line within the code of ethics. It doesn't tell you, oh, when the client says, I want advice, you immediately reject. There isn't this. So, but what we do know in the code of ethics is ensuring the client is aware of the different roles or different support functions, whether is it as a role of a coach, counselor, therapist, leader, guide, facilitator, and all those things. So if the client is transcending to the boundary and they're coming to the session, and the context of the session is that the client is coming to you, which means that they are probably a paid client or maybe a client, maybe they have a sponsor. So based on whatever the context is, then I have to allow the client to first share. So in terms of my best practices, I would say, hey, client, can you tell me a little bit more first before I reject him, right? Or before I even say, oh, I need to refer you to someone else. Very much like earlier, this time I mentioned this idea where the client comes to you and say, hey, coach, I'd like to talk about how to murder someone. But I use such provocative thing, but because if you think about it, the client is not coming to you with that. There's something behind that. So I allow the person to first share what do they mean by that, or tell me a little bit more about what are you looking for. So if the client says I want some advice about my career, then I say, hey, can you share me a little bit more? What are some thoughts, or what would you like to receive, or what would that do for you? So I would jump beyond that. So you think about this, right? Let me write here. Okay, maybe I'll put here. Okay. So when client comes to you with an gray, yeah, I call it gray focus area, what is the best thing to do? Okay, so I would say the easiest thing to do first is to clarify what the client wants. Okay, whatever word they use, I can use advice, um, coach. Can you coach me around this? Sometimes even if they come the word coach me around this, maybe they're really looking for advice. Maybe they're looking for some solution, right? So even their own definition is a bit misaligned. So I want to let the client first share what is it that the client really means by that. Then I also want to check in with my own beliefs or awareness or presuppositions around that topic. Okay, was I triggered by that? For example, the client says, "Oh, okay, this may be more for ladies." The client says, "Oh, I want to talk about miscarriage." Okay, so if I'm a lady and I've been through a personal experience like that before, then it may trigger something. So am I aware of those triggers? Or if I was previously retrenched and I know that this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and the client says, "Hey, I'd like to talk about retrenchment," and because I'm so passionate about it, it's my passion overriding the awareness of the client in the moment. Now, even in all this process, what is most important is not just the awareness of this, but if you think about this, it's also about something else, right? It's about going beyond that and asking ourselves, what is the ends? So if the client is asking me, oh, I want to have some advice on my career, what is the ends? The ends is, okay, well, if you had the advice, what would that change for you? Or what would change for you? Or suppose you have that advice, suppose you have that whatever, that ABCDD, what would that mean for you? So I jump from just exploring. So don't get stuck in the means, but explore the ends, right? And sometimes we call the ends as the outcome or the resultant fruits. Okay. So whenever the client says, I want this, but that's not what they want. They want something out of that thing. Right. So I may ask the client to just jump and clarify. And then after spending a few minutes and then after clarifying, it really sounds like the client really wants advice. Then I said, okay, it sounds like, so can I, then I'll ask the client to clarify really, first understanding what the role of a coach is in the coaching process. And if the client has a mismatch of roles and identity, then I would advise the client the next steps. Right. So you notice the role of the coach is not just straight off cut off them, but also hearing what is it that they want and then reframing it if it makes sense for the client. If it doesn't, then allowing the client to do the next step. Okay. Now, because sometimes I've heard coaches when they start the session, they immediately ask the client, let's close our eyes and meditate. Or let's close our eyes and do a few breaths to center ourselves. Now, is there anything wrong with that? So if I ask everybody today, Irene, please close your eyes. I want you to center yourself. Take 3 deep breaths in. Take 4 deep. Now, it may work for me as the coach to be present, but it may not work for the client. So I need to be also aware of how I set up the session to honor the client's experience. And that's why you also notice in the coaching process, there's this word called honoring the client in that session. Okay, so we had a question here. So Gautam asks, would ask client some questions to explore what really the client wants to know, thereafter assess whether we are the best position to help, or direct the client to someone else that can provide more relevant advice. Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point there. Right? So ask a few questions first. Explore the context around what that thing really is. Ensure the client has clarity about the expectations of the roles of coaching, and then allow the client to make the decision where is best to choose from, or direct the client accordingly. Yeah, Guru, you had a question.
Yeah. So just going back to the session objective and the coaching agreement. When somebody says I want advice, are they really asking for advice, or this is what the goal they want to get to? But if you actually set up the coaching framework, where you actually explain what the coaching does, then why would this question come up saying being an advice? I want some advice. What do you think? Because if you've done the coaching framework, and that's when you already explained what to expect out of the coaching,
yep.
And then the client asks for, I want some advice.
Because most of the time the client forgets.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's just like in our learning portal in the past, and some of us are going through level 1, level 2, level 3 trainings. All the materials are there, but do we remember, right? Do we forget?
So in which case, it's a very good point then to recall that to the client and say, as we said, the coaching agreement framework, we did discuss this, and then double confirm whether they want an advice or they would like to discuss this further.
Yeah, and then you reconfirm with them.
Yeah.
Especially when you do that's a good point where we talk a little bit about competency 3, which is the coaching agreement. So when the client has really established that and you sign the documents, or the client is made known, right? The client is already aware. You may be in session 3 or 4 or 5. It could be second month, third month. The client may have forgotten, right? Or maybe it's just the busyness of life or the work that the client feels, okay, hey, Guru, I really need some advice. I need you to tell me something. Now, at the point of time, is advice really what they want? So maybe they're just using the word advice interchangeably, but maybe what they really want is just to have someone to speak to gain some clarity. So we redefine what the topic is. Now, as a coach, is it okay to give any advice in the coaching process?
This is a tricky one, Jedi, because technically you are not supposed to advise, but in the past, there have been certain instances where you can talk about observation, and that's not advice; it's an observation, right? And that can be done with the client's permission as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So so now we bring in the other light layers, which is competency 7. Okay, 4 and 7. Now, advice has this connotation that you have to listen to my advice, and because that is the good advice. Usually, advice means that you have to follow my advice, right? But when we look at the coaching context, because we have experience, some of us have experience in a certain field and domain. When we offer our ideas and thoughts and perspective, that is where we can offer them. That's part of competency 7 or evoking awareness. The client can only see that far, right? Their situational awareness or their spatial awareness or whatever awareness they have is only that boundary. Now the coach can see something more. The coach can offer that to the client, but not as a form of advice, but as a form of helping the client to gain awareness, and not false awareness, but inviting the client to consider some of the coach intuition or the coach observations or the coach thoughts and ideas and perspectives. So the coach can share perspectives or thoughts with the client, but at a certain stage of the conversation, not at the start. And usually I would say it has to be after the midway. Because if it's at the start, then you're just imposing a lot of your viewpoints. Usually after the midway of the conversation, we kind of know the boundary of the client's awareness. And I know, okay, let's say the client is bounded in this awareness, they cannot see beyond that. But as the role of a coach, I could see some possibilities. Then I hold that possibilities very lightly. It doesn't mean that my awareness is 100% correct, or it doesn't mean that my approach is the only way. But I offer that as a way for the client to consider. So I would start with something like this. I say, client, can I share some observation, or could I share some ideas for you to consider? Can I share some thoughts for you to think about? Right? Let me know if this makes any sense. So it doesn't become an advice, but it becomes as a way to facilitate or evoke awareness. And that's why you see, notice the word there. It's not advice giving, because advice has the connotation you follow through, but it's an observation to allow the client to consider different perspectives. Yeah. Chris, you had a question.
Yeah, I just find this a bit okay. If I can just put this in this context. So you see, advice is something that when you give, for example, is a view, is a perspective, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is to follow through. I mean, that's how I see advice. Somebody asks you about an opinion. What is the best car to buy today for the most fuel efficient car? Then you okay, in your experience, you've driven this, that's a car that maybe you can consider. So in this way of saying things, do you mean that that's
advice?
That is an advice.
Yeah, that's an advice. So I give an example, the same example, right? Let's say the client says, "Oh, I'm thinking about what car to buy." Right? I'm not too sure, but you have experience, right? And if I said, "Okay, based on my advice, I think you should consider this as the best way forward," then what happens is that I'm framing the way of thinking for the client. This is how you should think. Like 3 points. Okay, think about fuel efficiency. Think about lifespan of car. Think about this. And based on my thoughts, I think you should go for this brand of car. Now, it doesn't mean that the client is forced to take that advice, but rather the way of thinking or the framing of thinking now it's on the coach end, because I've tell him that this is what you should think about. If I flip it to the other side of the coaching, more of a coaching style, I would say, hey, what if we consider, client, can I offer some thoughts for you to consider? What if we consider some areas about the fuel efficiency or the materials and other things? How would that influence your priorities or the way you think about selecting the car?
Okay, so I understand the part about not giving direct advice and allowing the client to explore instead. But let me give you another example. Let's say today, after a few sessions, this client is trying to be a better leader, for example. He wants to do this leadership coaching. And then at the end of it, he asks you a point-blank question. He said, if, for example, I would like you to know if there's one book out there about this particular domain of leadership, what book would you recommend? Okay, let's say it's very point blank, right? So, and then you have the answer, for example, because you have read a particular book and you find it very useful. So surely you have to say, yeah, this is a book you can consider, right? Is that advice?
Yeah, but that's not advice as in the advice of way of thinking, right? That is just towards the end additional resources. So competency 8, you have like allowing the client to consider additional resources and support for the client. So at the point of time, if the client says this at the start, can you tell me which book?
Yeah.
Right at the start of the conversation, then I'll probably reject him because I first need to understand what's the topic that he's looking for. But towards the end, the client says, "Hey, okay, we've explored everything, we've done all the action steps and everything. Coach, is there like 1 or 2 resources or books that you can recommend to me?" Now, Because at that stage is competency 8, where we're looking at additional resources or obstacles. Then I can say, hey, yeah, I have some ideas or some 1 or 2 books that I came across before, which I thought would be helpful. Is it okay for me to share some ideas for you to think about it? Then I offer the 1 or 2 book choices. Then I invite the client to respond to that.
Okay. So what you're essentially saying is that from an advisory perspective, it really, number one, depends on the context, when it's being provided, whether it's at the start, at the end, and also the way you put forth. It must be very, in a sense of for consideration, rather than say, hey, do this, do that. I advise you to do this. This is probably a good option for you. All that we should avoid, right?
Yeah, and it's to facilitate the clients linking the thoughts. That means, is this awareness coming from me or is it coming from the client? So if the client is like waiting for the coach to feed them the awareness, then my role is not to give them immediate awareness so fast, right? I want to kind of help them to connect the dots or help them to see. So I'm facilitating through the questions and also through observations to help them connect some dots for themselves. So even if, let's say, the book, they ask, hey, what is one book that you highly recommend? If the client asks me this question, then I can offer the book first as an immediate response to the person, and I'll ask the client a follow-up question. I said, hey, what are you looking for in the book, or what do you hope to get out of the book?
Okay.
And then you notice the stages of the conversation. That's why you look. Competency 7 is on evoking awareness. Competency 8 is on facilitating learning and growth. So the keywords are: is this thing helping to evoke more awareness? Right? Is that thing helping to facilitate the growth of the client, the learning for the client? If the evocation of awareness, it's a false awareness, then okay, then I need to think about how do I phrase the question. So you notice that one of the things that a lot of the guys tend to do is they use the word so. So what they're saying is this. So then the conclusion is done by the coach, not the client. Yeah. So I would say avoid the word so, or avoid the word therefore you're saying this. Right. So then it becomes interrogative, or it becomes me, I'm concluding, I'm thinking for the client.
Okay, Ken, thanks.
Okay, so good question. Gordon had the response. He says, I think from an ethical standpoint, why not? Just to help a fellow human being in whatever way you can, but important to cycle back the intent of coaching. Yeah. So sometimes you can offer that immediate response to the client. Like the client, if you ask the client, hey, coach, do you think what I did was correct? But my response is an empathic response. For example, the client sees the situation. Oh, I noticed that one of my friends was crying, and then I reached out to them and I just give them a call. It's past 12 midnight, and she's they're of an opposite sex. So I just but she was crying over the phone, so I comforted her. Coach, do you think what I did was correct? So I cannot say, oh, coaching, I cannot respond correct or not correct, right? But in an empathic response, I would say, hey, I would like to I would like to acknowledge, you feeling concerned for your client, and I feel that what you did really supported your client. So my response to the client was more of an empathic response, to acknowledge the client's work in whatever they're doing. And I think Shin's had another comment. She says that I think this rests on both the coach and client being very, very disciplined, remembering that straightforward advice shouldn't be given. Chances are most people drift out of the discipline during coaching sessions. Yes. So the discipline of keeping to the core of the coaching is key, because the idea is that before the coaching session or before the actual coaching session begins, I will let the client know that sometimes when we ask for advice, what are we really looking for? Right. Just like today, many people just ask ChatGPT for advice. Right. Okay, what to do about this, or they ask Perplexity, or they ask DeepSeek, or they ask whatever. They ask for advice. They want the immediate answer. But what the AI cannot do is to prompt that question. Like, how did the question came about? Or what about this question that you're really looking for? Right. So therefore, the coaching process is really taking a step back and saying, "Hey, coach, hey, client, I would love to give you the straightforward answer, but if I give you the straightforward answer, what would tend to happen is that it may not give you the best outcome, because the solution is the easy part, but defining that actual problem or the presenting problem, that's the harder part. So in the coaching process, we spend a little time first to kind of define what the exact scope of the problem or the performance issue or the challenge is. And then from there, I may ask a few clarifying questions and help you to evoke awareness about perspectives and help you shift ideas and thoughts for you to consider. And then towards the end, we may kind of design some actions they can take forward. So I kind of let the client know the process of why this is so the client can understand what is the real rationale behind it. Okay. Yeah. And I think the discipline is important. And otherwise it'll be very, very challenging for both people to go with in and out. Okay, good. Great questions from everyone. Okay. So let's go a little bit more. Yeah. With all this, like we mentioned earlier, right? The three A's: awareness, assess, and then act as the coach. So based on the ethical consideration, are you aware? Then you assess, then you act on that.